One.
All right, everybody. So if you could just flip open to the notes where it says Industrialization, a case study. Today we're going to focus on the city of Manchester and talk about how this one little microcosm of the Industrial Revolution reveals a lot of truths about the way that this period manifested itself around the globe in the United States. So to start out, it's important to note and really reflect on how influential industrialization really was. So there's a word that I've used before in class, or a phrase when I've called something a mixed blessing. So with a lot of monumental changes, there are a lot of people who benefit from it immediately, some people who benefit from it down the line, and there's other people who, for lack of a better term, become victims of it. So you guys have spent a lot of time talking about the people who were important in working in the factories, but also became victims of a lot of the health concerns that came out of the period. So pollution, child labor laws that were non-existent, the spread of disease because of the Industrial Revolution. All of those things were very real and very negative short-term effects of the period. So what it also did, though, is brought about a lot of positive change. So you've heard of a luxury good before, and a luxury good is essentially anything that you don't need for basic survival. So anything beyond the basic clothing, shelter, and food that you need to provide the sustenance to be alive, those are necessities. Anything beyond that is a luxury. And the Industrial Revolution really made those things possible. So we've used the example of Supreme a few times in class. Although Supreme is, a maker of clothing, including shirts and pants and stuff like that, a Supreme shirt is not actually a necessity. It's a luxury because it's much more expensive, much more finite, much more unique than an individual shirt or a jacket that you might need to provide yourself with safety and being out in the environment. So with the Industrial Revolution, because you had the opportunity to create things in massive proportions, you could create markets for these things that other people would want. So, for example, one of the things that was really popular was to get cuisine and foods that previously wouldn't have been available to you. So we've used the example of, even up here in Easton, Massachusetts, you can hop over to Shaw's and buy a strawberry in January. That is largely thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Now, of course, that is an example of something that is grown in the ground and people take care of it and fertilize it, so on and so forth. But the fact that it's gotten to you here in Easton is a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. So because of the way that the industry was shaping itself around factories, what another short-term change to come about was the rise of the urban city. And we call that effect urbanization. It's when people move from rural settings to urban settings. So one of the things that's often used as a focal point in any urban setting is the water supply. So sometimes it provides clean drinking water, sewage opportunities, but it also provides a medium for which you can exchange your goods and bring in natural resources that you need to produce those finished goods. So if you think about all of the major cities that you've been to, I bet you can imagine that there's specific water sources that are somewhere close to that major city. So that word again is urbanization. It's the growth of cities. It's the movement of people from one place to the other. So migration, most of you can probably trace your ancestry back to a time when a group of people came to the United States from another country. So I know there's a lot of Irish people in class. You might be able to trace your family's origins in this country back to the Irish potato famine. So that had less to do with industry and more to do with the fact that people were looking to leave one place and go to another because of basic survival. In London, for example, you had what could be considered a population explosion. So check out the statistic. In Manchester, the population grew from 45,000 in 1760 to less than a century later, 300,000. So you've got a 600% increase in less than a century in one place. That's a great thing in terms of being able to spread ideas, beliefs, so on and so forth, but it can also lead to a lot of dangerous situations. Number one, The lack of adequate sanitation led to an easy spread of disease. So imagine, if you will, for a second, even a city like Boston, 150 years ago, um, we complain a lot about the smog of cars and factories spilling off different pollution, and I'm not trying to downplay that. But imagine, if you will, for a second, your horse dies going down the middle of the road in Boston. It would have been totally common for people just to leave that horse on the side of the road in the middle of the city. So in addition to having raw sewage, animal meat, all sorts of things on the side of the road, you've got people living literally and figuratively on top of each other. Because you've got to remember, once the cities get built out and a lot of them buttress a major water support or major water supply, there's no way to build your city out. The only way to build it is up, which leads to a lot of inherent problems too, when you've got nobody reviewing the way that those homes are built, how they support themselves, if there's any fire escapes, so on and so forth. All of those things kind of became afterthoughts that we deal with today, but in the 1800s was really just something that people didn't consider. We're lucky enough, you guys are watching this video because of public education, right? You have a system where society collects money from all of the people in the town. They pool their resources, they pay teachers, they get technology, and we have a system in which ideas can be transferred to you in an expedient fashion. During the Industrial Revolution, that wasn't the case. The average person, if they were educated, came from only one element of society, and that was it. Don't be distracted by this number. So it says in 1842, the average lifespan of a city dweller was 17, while that of somebody who lived in a rural setting was 38. We've talked about this before. Sometimes averages can be misleading. You got to remember, one of the main reasons why this number is so low is because so many people died in childbirth, which is important to consider too. Infant mortality was incredibly high when compared to modern standards, even in the United States. So you guys have spent a lot of time looking at the working conditions in factories. You read some great primary sources, especially from children, describing how long they worked, what those conditions were like, how dangerous it could be. Many of them got maimed. Many of them had long-term problems like mesothelioma and other versions of cancer that came as a direct result of working in those settings. I thought this picture was kind of interesting. The lack of access to proper ventilation and clean air led to this pretty entrepreneurial project where somebody created a baby cage. You could stick your baby out the window to get them fresh air if it was too stuffy and polluted on the inside of your dwelling. So kids lost limbs, lost fingers. These are kids called breaker boys. They're cracking open coal, essentially. This kid has lost his left arm. This political cartoon speaks to the idea that all of this was done in the name of profit. So you had a group of people, especially communists, who were very critical of the practice of industrialization because it led to very serious and long-term maladies, especially for children. So women and children became the cheapest source of labor, and thus some of the primary targets for some of the biggest social inequality that came from the period. So I believe you might have read this excerpt from William Cooper in the primary source activity you did in class, so I won't spend too much time on it. But the big theme, of course, was that this kid's entire life revolved around working for this factory. So because of this, you have the rise of class tensions, and this is kind of the human condition, if you will, the haves and the have-nots. And there tends to be a lot of animosity between those two groups, with a lot of people who end up somewhere in the middle. The Industrial Revolution really put a microscope on this situation and exacerbated it in many cases. So the working class didn't see a lot of initial benefits, but there was a lot of long-term benefits. So there was a lot of things that did change for the positive for people over the course of a couple centuries. Education, science, better wages for people. And because of the influence of unions and things like that, it did eventually lead to better working conditions for people. And that's why we currently have the laws that we do today, protecting workers.